For 20 years, Nolan Reed believed his wife had drowned in the black water beneath Blackwater Lake, where a burned-out car was pulled from the depths, but no body was ever found. He built a quiet life out of the wreckage, raising their son alone, filling his evenings with engine grease and silence instead of grief he refused to name. Then, on a rain-soaked afternoon at the train station, he saw a face he had buried 2 decades earlier. Beside her stood a young woman with gray eyes that matched his own, eyes he had only ever seen in a mirror and in his son's face. The woman he had mourned looked at him, trembling, and whispered 4 words that undid everything he thought he understood about his own life. She told him not to say her name because someone was still watching them. If you want to know how a wife the world called dead survived 20 years in silence, stay until the end because the truth she carries will cost someone everything. Nolan Reed had come to the Blackwater train station for nothing more complicated than a crate of parts for the 1967 Mustang sitting half-finished-ish in his shop. And he had expected the afternoon to end the way most of his afternoons ended, with grease under his fingernails and the radio playing low while he worked in peace. His life had settled into something manageable over the years: a small restoration garage on the edge of town, a house that still smelled faintly of sawdust, and a son named Elliot, who called less often now that he had built a career of his own 2 states away. Nolan had made peace, or something close to it, with the shape his life had taken after the accident that stole his wife from him when Elliot was barely 3 years old. He did not expect the crowd at the station to part the way it did, or for his eyes to land on a woman standing near the ticket counter, whose face stopped his breath in his chest. She was older, thinner, and her eyes kept sliding toward the exits the way a person's eyes move when they have spent years learning not to be found. The station smelled of wet concrete and diesel, and somewhere behind him, a departure board clattered through its rotations, but Nolan barely registered any of it. His whole body suddenly narrowed down to the single fact of her face. Nolan told himself it was impossible, that grief could conjure faces out of strangers if a man let it. But the longer he stared, the more certain he became that this was not a trick of memory. It was Maren. His wife, the woman he had married in a church with peeling paint and buried in a coffin that the coroner had sworn contained her remains, was standing 30 feet away in a station full of people who had no idea the ground beneath them had just shifted. Beside her stood a young woman, no older than 20, with dark hair and a familiar set to her jaw, and eyes the exact shade of gray that none saw every morning in the mirror, and had seen in his son's face since the day the boy was born. Nolan said her name before he could stop himself, and the sound of it seemed to physically strike her because Maren flinched and grabbed the younger woman's arm and began pulling her toward the far doors before he had even taken a full step forward. He caught up to them on the sidewalk outside, rain starting to needle down around them, and demanded to know how a dead woman was standing in front of him breathing. Maren would not look at him directly. Her attention fixed instead on a black sport utility vehicle idling across the street, its windows tinted dark enough that Nolan could not tell if anyone sat inside. She told him in a voice stripped thin by fear that they could not be seen standing together in a place with cameras, and that every second they lingered increased a danger he did not yet understand. When he pressed her for an explanation, she asked only one thing of him: that he take them somewhere no one would think to look. Before Nolan could answer, the young woman turned to Maren with a question that landed harder than anything else that afternoon. She asked in a voice caught between hope and disbelief, whether this stranger standing in the rain was truly her father. Nolan drove them to the old storage building behind his garage, a space he used for parts he no longer needed, but could not bring himself to throw away. And for a long moment, none of them spoke, while rain drummed against the metal roof. The single bulb overhead buzzed and swayed slightly whenever wind pushed through a gap in the siding, throwing long shadows across shelves crowded with carburetors and coiled hose, and the smell of old motor oil settled over the 3 of them like something almost comforting in its ordinariness. Nolan sat on an overturned crate because his legs did not entirely trust him to stand, and he found himself studying the 2 women across from him the way he might study an engine that refused to start, searching for the one detail that would explain everything. He could not stop looking at the young woman, could not reconcile the shape of her face with anything he understood about his own history. Yet some old animal instinct in him refused to dismiss what his eyes kept insisting was true. Maren finally broke the silence, her hands wrapped tightly around a paper cup of coffee she had not touched, and told him that when she vanished 20 years earlier, she had been carrying a child neither of them yet knew existed. Nolan felt some cold move through his chest because even in the depths of his grief, he had never imagined a version of the truth that included a daughter he had never been told about. The young woman introduced herself as Sloane Hart, though she said the surname carefully as though it belonged to a costume rather than a name. She explained that she had grown up believing her father died before she was born. A story repeated so many times that it had calcified into something she never thought to question. Only 2 weeks earlier, her mother had finally told her that her father was not dead at all, that he was alive and living less than a day's drive from where they had been hiding. Sloane did not call Nolan anything resembling a father in that first conversation, choosing instead to study him the way a person studies a stranger who happens to share their face, cataloging the similarities without yet trusting what they might mean. Nolan noticed she pressed her fingers against the edge of the table when she grew tense, an unconscious habit identical to one he shared with Elliot, and the resemblance rattled him more than any words could have. He told them plainly that 2 decades of lies could not be undone by a resemblance, however striking, and that he needed proof before he let himself believe any of it. Marin agreed without hesitation, but warned him they could not send a sample to any ordinary laboratory because Gideon Wycliffe had people embedded in hospitals, courts, and private data firms across the region. The name hit Nolan like a stone dropped into still water because he remembered it from the earliest days of their marriage back when Marin's family had made their disapproval of a small-town mechanic marrying into their world unmistakably clear. He understood then that whatever had pulled his wife back from the dead was not a simple story of a woman running from grief, but something far larger and far more dangerous than he had allowed himself to imagine. Before he could ask another question, Marin reached into her bag and set a photograph on the table between them, its edges worn soft from handling. It showed Nolan walking a 3-year-old Elliot into his first day of preschool. An ordinary morning frozen in time, except the photograph had clearly been taken 12 years after the date on Marin's death certificate. The story that unfolded that evening carried Nolan back 20 years to a version of his life he had only ever understood in fragments. Marin had been born into the Wycliffe family, daughter of the late Augustus Wycliffe, the founder of Wycliffe Crown Holdings, an empire built across decades of shrewd investment and careful public image. She had never wanted the crown that came with the name, choosing instead to marry a mechanic from a town most of her relatives could not locate on a map, and she had endured her family's cold disapproval without complaint because Nolan had never once made her feel like a consolation prize. In the early years of their marriage, she used to joke that the Wycliffe name was a coat she had finally learned to take off, hanging it by the door of their small house and stepping into a life measured in oil changes and grocery lists instead of boardrooms. She had believed foolishly perhaps that distance alone would be enough to keep the family's ambitions from ever touching the life she had built for herself. After Augustus died, his younger brother Gideon assumed control of the company and with it control over nearly everything the Wycliffe name still touched. Marin had watched her uncle tighten his grip on the family's fortune with a patience that unsettled her long puff before she understood exactly why. 3 days before she disappeared, Marin discovered that Gideon had been siphoning hundreds of millions of dollars out of the company's employee pension fund through a web of shell corporations designed to obscure the trail. Digging further, sleepless and increasingly afraid, she found documents suggesting her own father's signature had been forged across dozens of financial filings in the years before his death. Papers that would have exposed a fraud stretching back further than she dared imagine. She made the decision to gather every piece of evidence she could find and deliver it to federal investigators, believing naively that the truth alone would be enough to protect her family from her uncle's ambition. Gideon learned of her plan before she could act on it. And his response was not a threat spoken aloud, but a manila envelope left on her doorstep containing photographs of Nolan and Elliot taken without their knowledge. Proof that her family knew exactly where to find the people she loved most. Silas Crow, the family's longtime director of security, came to her that same week with an offer that felt less like rescue and more like surrender. He told her that if she wanted her husband and son to remain safe, her grief would need to be real in every detail. Because Gideon would not be fooled by a staged disappearance if Nolan's mourning ever wavered into something less than genuine. A car resembling Marin was pushed into Blackwater Lake and set ablaze before sinking. And the dental records used to identify the body recovered from the wreckage had been quietly substituted by someone loyal to the family. Marin told herself in the earliest days of her exile that she would only need to disappear for a few months, just long enough for Silas to build a case strong enough to protect her when she returned. Those months stretched into years, and the years eventually became 2 decades she never intended to lose. Nolan asked her, his voice low and controlled in a way that frightened him more than shouting would have, why she never came back once. She believed herself safe. Marin's answer came slowly, each word costing her something. She told him that Silas had once tried to bring her home, arranging the earliest stages of a return that would have reunited her with Nolan and introduced him to the daughter he never knew he had. Before that plan could move forward, Silas vanished without explanation. And every channel Marin had used to communicate with the outside world went silent within days of his disappearance. Marin spent those 20 years moving through a patchwork of borrowed names and rented rooms. First through Oregon, then further north into Montana, eventually settling for a time near the Canadian border before finally putting down something resembling roots in a small coastal town in Maine. She learned to live light, keeping a single suitcase packed beneath whatever bed she slept in. And she learned the particular loneliness of watching other families gather at diner tables on ordinary Sunday mornings while she sat alone with a newspaper she used more as a shield than a source of news. There were towns where she stayed only weeks and towns where she stayed years. And in every one of them she kept a small photograph of Nolan folded inside a coat pocket, worn soft at the creases from being unfolded too many times in the dark. In the earliest years, Silas had still been able to send her photographs of Nolan and Elliot, proof that they remained safe. Each image a small mercy that let her sleep through another night of exile. He had also warned her again and again that Gideon's people had never stopped watching Blackwater, waiting patiently for the moment she made a mistake that would confirm what he already suspected. Marin wrote letters during those years, dozens of them, addressed to a husband who would never receive a single one because she trusted no method of delivery except passing them through Silas. And Silas alone controlled whether they ever left his hands. When Silas disappeared, Marin was left with no way to know whether he had betrayed her, been discovered by Gideon, or simply been erased the way so many inconvenient people in her family's orbit seemed to disappear. Without a trusted intermediary, she convinced herself that any attempt to reach out would place Nolan and Elliot directly in danger. And so she let the silence continue long after that. The fear that justified it had curdled into something closer to habit. Nolan listened to all of it without softening, unwilling to accept an explanation that reduced his son's entire childhood to a decision made unilaterally on his behalf. He told her plainly that grief he could forgive, but the theft of his right to know the truth about his own life was a different kind of wound entirely. Sloane, who had said little through most of the conversation, finally spoke up with a question of her own, asking her mother whether the same lie had been used to protect both sides of the family from each other. Marin did not flinch from the accusation. She admitted that fear alone no longer explained everything. That somewhere in the passing years she had simply lost the ability to imagine what a return might look like, or how she would begin explaining 20 years of absence to a husband and son who had already learned to live without her. Nolan asked her more sharply now why she had chosen this particular moment to resurface after so long spent hiding. In answer, Marin slid a thick folder across the table, its cover embossed with the small silver crown that marked every official document belonging to Wycliffe Crown Holdings. Sloane would turn 21 years old in exactly 3 days. And that single fact, Marin explained, carried the power to unravel everything Gideon Wycliffe had spent 2 decades building. Augustus Wycliffe before his death had structured a trust that held 51% of the voting shares in Wycliffe Crown Holdings, a controlling stake designed to protect the company from exactly the kind of consolidation Gideon had since achieved. Gideon had only ever been granted temporary stewardship of those shares under the condition that Marin had died without leaving behind a legitimate heir of her own. A hidden clause within the trust, one Gideon believed had died with Augustus, specified that control would automatically revert to Marin or to her biological child the moment the child turned 21, and that the transfer would trigger a mandatory audit of every pension fund and corporate account the company controlled. For 20 years, Gideon had built his empire on the confident assumption that Marin was dead and that no heir existed to threaten his position. He was at that very moment finalizing the sale of a substantial portion of the company to a foreign investment fund. A deal structured to close before Sloane's birthday made her legal claim impossible to ignore. Once that sale closed, Marin explained, the financial evidence of Gideon's fraud would be scattered across so many shell companies that even a federal investigation might never fully reconstruct it. She possessed only a copy of the trust's hidden clause because the sole original document had been hidden by Silas Crow somewhere in Blackwater before his disappearance 2 decades earlier. Days before showing up at the train station, Marin had received a recording from a lawyer representing Silas's estate. A message set to release automatically after his death. And in it, Silas revealed that the original document had been concealed inside something belonging to Nolan. Nolan felt the memory surface before he consciously reached for it. The image of a wooden toolbox Marin had given him the day he opened his garage. A gift he had treasured enough to keep for 20 years without ever suspecting it held anything but wrenches and sockets. The three of them drove back to the shop through streets slick with rain, headlights smearing gold across the wet asphalt, and none of them spoke because there seemed to be nothing left that words could accomplish. When they arrived, Nolan found the toolbox exactly where it had always sat, undisturbed in the corner of the storage room for 2 full decades. Its brass latches dulled with age, but still intact beneath a thin film of dust. When he pried it open, his hands were not entirely steady, and what he found waiting inside was not the sealed document Marin had described, but a room that had clearly been searched already. Drawers overturned and the lock on the storage door forced open sometime before their arrival. Scrolled across the wall behind the emptied toolbox in handwriting none of them recognized was a single sentence meant to be read as both a warning and a threat. The words read simply that the dead ought to know better than to stop staying buried. Shaken but unwilling to retreat, Nolan reached out that same night to Delaney Price, a lawyer he had trusted since their school years together and the only person he could think of with the expertise to make sense of a trust document this complicated. She arrived at the garage, still dressed from a late night at her own office, reading glasses pushed up into her hair, and listened to the entire story without once interrupting, her expression shifting slowly from polite skepticism to something closer to alarm as the pieces began to fit together in front of her. Delaney confirmed that the clause Marin described could well be legally binding, but cautioned that a photocopy alone would never withstand the scrutiny of a company as well-resourced and well-lawyered as Wycliffe Crown Holdings. She suggested bringing in Elliot, whose career as a forensic data auditor made him uniquely suited to trace the layers of shell companies Gideon had used to hide his fraud, even though the suggestion meant reopening a wound Nolan had spent years trying to protect his son from. Elliot arrived in Blackwater the following morning, fully convinced that his father had fallen victim to a pair of elaborate con artists, preying on an old man's unresolved grief, and he had rehearsed the entire drive down a version of the conversation, where he gently but firmly talked his father back to reason. That certainty collapsed the moment he saw Marin's face in person. Recognizing in an instant the same features he had only ever known from a handful of surviving photographs, kept in a drawer his father rarely opened. Photographs he used to study as a boy trying to imagine a voice to match the smile. Something in his chest went hollow and cold. The careful speech he had prepared dissolving into nothing at all. There was no tearful reunion, no embrace between mother and son, separated by 20 years of silence.